turning back into the 1970s, not a good idea. But I don't think that's what he'll do. He didn't do it in Manchester, so why should he do it nationally?
Welcome, one and all. Welcome back to How to Win an Election. I'm Hugo Rifkind, and gathered in the studio like Keir Starmer's allies clustered around the bar after being purged by the Manchester Mafia, I'm joined by Labour insider Sally Morgan. Hello, Sally.
Hello.
How are you keeping?
Very good, thank you.
Good to have you here. I still can't say this word. Perspicacious policy queen, Polly Mackenzie. Hello, Polly.
Hello, Hugo.
How are you?
Well, somebody on the way up referred to you just as Rifkind.
Really?
Earlier.
Well, that's fine.
I was like, yeah.
It's good to take
cool.
ownership of that name, and in the past I've often had to share it. And also Tory peer and Times columnist Danny Finkelstein. Hello, Danny.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you very much indeed. All the better for being with you.
Good to have you all here. Polly, I've been thinking about kittens in the army, and I think it might be a good idea. Cats in the army, more than kittens. Kittens are rather feeble, but an army and a whole battalion of cats dropped on our enemies.
Yeah, cats carry some sort of disease, toxoplasmosis. So they could use it as a biohazard. They could just sort of defecate everywhere and infect pregnant women.
I mean, that would make battles take some months, I feel, whereas thinking more of them going at them with their claws. But no, Danny.
I don't think it'll happen because the dogs will vote against it.
Well, I mean, the dogs will only get votes once Polly's in charge, obviously. Do send your questions, thoughts and various nonsense to howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. It's always good to hear your thoughts about our thoughts. We're going to look at Andy Burnham's first week in government this week. Has he hit the ground running, or are we already seeing some problems with his approach to making promises without being entirely clear on how they'll be paid for? Some people might say that's just politics as usual. Danny, we have talked in the past about the risk that Andy Burnham is a politician who likes to say yes to everyone. Is there any sign he's changed tack now he's in Downing Street?
I'm a little bit concerned about it in the first couple of days because you would think you'd want to make some big strategic moves. Instead, they're quite tactical. They're relatively small because he's got to be able to indicate he can pay for it out of savings. And, even when you look at something like moving on fuel prices and VAT, they're about to get an increase in prices, so it'll be cancelled out. And I think the idea of trying to save people from the crush of the cost of living by simply government intervening to prevent it just won't work, because it'll circulate the money from one person back to someone else and around in a big circle. So I am a bit concerned about it. I suppose it was what I guessed, but not what I'd hoped for out of the first couple of days.
Sally, he spoke to reporters in Downing Street on Monday, and he said he wanted adult social care to be free at the point of use. He said he was considering cutting income tax for low earners. Is he sort of shooting from the hip a bit, do you think? Or is he deliberately... is he deliberately saying as little as possible? I think
it's two things. I think, firstly, Monday was setting out a broad direction and some big things, and I think I'm very sure he will end up doing something big on adult social care. He's been committed to it for 15 years. I think it's going to be really important. I don't think he needs to do, we've talked about this before, I don't think he needs to do very many substantial things, actually. And I think that will be one. And you can't do that overnight. So I think there's a difference between setting out big, broad direction, which I think is what he was doing on Monday, and painting pictures almost in terms of some of the saying, I do get it. And I think that's why we've seen, frankly, relatively small, relatively cheap things that he can do, because it's saying to people, I do get it, give me time. But I am going to try and make change when I can. So I think, I don't really agree with Danny. And I agree with bits of it, but I think the reality is that he appointed a new Chancellor on Monday. He could not make huge fiscal tax changes very quickly. John Healey's going to have to get his feet under the table, and he's going to have to spend the summer looking at it. So this is now heading towards the big things are the budget and beyond. But I think he wanted to do some quick, I get it. Said to you, I get it. I said to you, I've heard what you've said on the doorstep. This is what I can do now.
Just to be clear, that is fair. Right, so I don't expect big strategic, big public tax and spending announcements. I guess I thought he might try and do something a bit more structural in terms of government. But to be honest, you can't do those things in a couple of days. Let's see what he's got.
Polly, his response to almost everything seems to be, we need to have a look at this. And, well, in one sense, that's good. You do want government to have a look at various things. When you say we need to have a look at this, that makes people think, after having a look at it, you're going to do something about it. But, of course, he's not quite saying that. Can he just keep saying that to everything for the time being until perhaps, I don't know, right up the way to the budget?
I think he has not been the Prime Minister for very long, and it's a reasonable answer to things. And, Conservatives like to sort of exude a brand thing of course, when it comes to it, I'd really like to cut taxes. And we often accept that as not a commitment to cut taxes. So saying, as soon as I can, what I'd really love to see is that adult social care is free, is actually a reasonable way of reinforcing the story of who you are. I also think, actually, so I was really struck by Danny saying you thought they'd do something structural on government. I mean, they've done quite a lot of things that are structural on government, some of which I think are a bit troubling, but a really good thing, adopting basically the Future Governance Forum's recommendations around creating an Office of the Prime Minister in the Cabinet. Massive cutbacks to what's in the Cabinet Office, broadly correctly, though I'm worried about moving the Government Digital Service, which is, one of the highest functioning parts of government, into the outpost that is the Department of Culture, Media and Sport.
We'll come back to that, I promise.
And like abolishing DSIT, kind of mainstreaming science and technology in with growth, maybe a good idea, maybe a bad idea, but nevertheless, those are some big structural things, suggest they're thinking about the mechanisms of the state, not just the actions. And actually, so I went to the pub with my family at the weekend for lunch, and I was reminded that the government reduced VAT on children's meals over the summer. And I was like, I'd completely forgotten about that. That is a ludicrous, silly bung, right? Of just sort of randomly pouring water into the sand, a lot like Eat Out to Help Out during the pandemic, though even less justified. The thing that's interesting about Andy Burnham's the two immediate bungs is they are actually cleverer than that.
Remind us of those bungs.
So the first one is cutting VAT on electricity prices. And again, it's not fuel prices, it's electricity prices. Yeah. And actually, and it's interesting, he hasn't mentioned this. They haven't talked about this as a transition to net zero thing. They haven't tried to invoke a culture war. They've just said they want to give people some money back. But actually, one of the structural things we need to do in the energy market is reduce the comparative price of electricity and gas. And doing this, especially if they can carry it on for the long term, makes buying a heat pump or switching to an electric car more viable. So they're just telling a story of cutting the cost of living, but they're actually doing something that's much smarter than encouraging people to spend money at the pub, however fun that is. And again, the buses thing, much more sensible than some of the train freeze things, train fare freezes that the previous Labour government did, because the evidence is clear that actually for people who are at the margins of the labour market, particularly younger people, particularly people who are not taking home very much money, actually if it costs you like £8 or £9 to get to work and back every day, the viability of going to work and also your kind of travel radius of jobs you can take. So actually, it sounds like a bung. It's economically much more sound than lots of other bungs that could have been chosen.
I think that's
by the way, my point on structure was not about the things they've done with number 10 in departments, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't. I think they're going to spend forever mucking around with civil servants, moving people in department, and I didn't think that was a good idea. It's more about the idea of the North and devolution and a bit bolder. But to be fair, they may do that second or third. It's ridiculous. You can't judge them after 2 days. So both of you made perfectly fair points. I'm just a little bit worried that they wanted to lead off with the suggestion that from the centre we can really change people's cost of living all that much. I think the real responsibility of government is to try and make the country grow more. He has got a plan, which is to decentralise power. I would have liked, as a symbolic indicator of what the government's going to do, something more in that space than in the space of we're going to take 1p off this and 3p off that. So I don't think ultimately he's going to solve the problem in the slightest.
I mean, I think the problem is that it's very hard to do something big quickly unless you've had a lot of time. I think back to 97, Gordon had been Shadow Chancellor for years, and so no wonder there was Bank of England independence, because it had been planned for 18 months. Coming in and suddenly putting a new chancellor in or a new business secretary, I think it's pretty difficult. But you're right. I mean, the big test is going to be whether we get growth in the economy and whether he makes some bigger, braver decisions. But I think that'll be after the summer.
I'm sorry to be all sort of simplistic and messagey based, but I thought, Polly, explaining the sort of the nuts and bolts of detail of effects of behind the things that they've announced, I thought that was a fascinating answer. Why don't they talk about it in those terms? Why are they doing? I mean, the way you portray it, it's like they're doing stuff that's very, very clever, but allowing people to go, this is just bung, this is nonsense, this is retail.
Well, partly because they're actually interested in the retail message. And people say about Andy Burnham that he just wants to be liked. And it's perfectly possible for that to be a deficit of character. But it's not automatically a problem. Mm-hmm. You know, actually, if you want everyone to hate you, then really don't go into politics. Or if you don't care what people think of you, that you need a kind of thick skin. But actually, the idea of wanting to listen to people and give them, where it's possible, where it makes sense, the things that will improve their lives, like that's not a problem, actually.
Yeah. I've got a problem with it in message terms. I've got a problem with it as an indication of strategy. Insofar as it was intended to indicate strategy, I personally don't think that is going to work. It's a little bit better if you think of it in Polly's way, but my view is that the right things to do were some striking things which indicate their growth strategy. But you know, let's face it, they've been in office for 2 or 3 days. He's clearly appointed a chancellor who wasn't the anticipated candidate. So, you know, you can't expect them all to have aligned on that kind of immediate policy.
Let's talk about the Chancellor. Sally, the appointment of John Healey has been referred to by some as the equivalent of Gordon Brown appointing Alistair Darling as his Chancellor on the assumption that he'll just do number 10's bidding. But it didn't work out that way with Darling. Is that how we should see it with Healey?
No, I don't think it's bidding. I think it will be a partnership. I think people underestimate John. And obviously there was high drama around his resignation from defence, but John, you know, he's done 5 years, I think it was, in the Treasury, albeit quite a long time ago. He's seen what works and what doesn't about the Treasury, and there is a sort of Treasury way of doing things that, frankly, doesn't really change whoever's in power. And he is somebody, I think, who will recognise that quietly but with determination he will run the Treasury. And you know, I'm a huge fan, regardless of the party, for the politician to give very clear direction to the Treasury, and I think that's been one of the problems in the last 2 years. So I think Andy will have an enhanced economic setup, and frankly, number 10 should have. But I don't think it's because he'll be ruling the roost.
For anyone who wants to understand John Healey, Sally, tell us, who's he like? What kind of ite is he?
Oh.
Is he a nothingite?
I think he's his own. I think he's actually not a partisan person. Obviously, he worked with Gordon, worked for Gordon, but he wasn't a brownout. He wasn't a briefer. He wasn't out on manoeuvres. He was, you know, he's just not like that. He kind of gets on with things. He's got very strong base of support across the party, I would say. And you know, look, I'd thought about him quite a long time ago, but I didn't think I dismissed it. I have not heard any negative comments at all about disappointment, which is really interesting. And let me say, it's not typical.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, so actually, I mean, that speaks volumes. Actually,
one of the things that it can help with is this business of predicting things in politics. I think I've said this before, but I predicted there wouldn't be an election in 2017 because Theresa May told me there wasn't going to be one. But what happened is that she didn't know there wasn't going to be one. In other words, even the people inside didn't know. What dictated there was going to be an election was the strong political logic. So there we were discussing the Shabana versus Ed Miliband, and we all realised it didn't make very much sense for him to go and pick one side or another at the beginning of his premiership. And that's actually what's happened in the end. Whatever people thought would happen, what's happened is it followed the political logic. So we've learnt something about political predictions that will be useful for the next time we encounter that question.
There's actually lots in kind of consumer psychology about decision making, about how people, when stuck with a binary choice, is actually a late appearing third choice often. It's a good way to sell your jam.
A Home Secretary who wants to be a Home Secretary and is a very good Home Secretary. I mean, that doesn't happen a lot either.
Partly because you've said that you really want growth, and somebody who is very, very determined to substantially cut immigration, which is a key source of growth, might be a barrier.
Can I just ask this, Sally? So I've got a theory that if someone isn't actually a Blairite or actually sort of solidly on the kind of campaign group left, they belong to a very broad, which is called brown light, but is really basically a broad, relatively undifferentiated group of people who are sort of on the terms use soft left. I don't mean that in a.
No, it's not soft left. I don't think. Yeah.
I know people don't like the term soft, but I don't mean it in an insulting way. It's just the term everyone uses. He just belong to that. He's got a bit of a union background. He's theoretically always been a bit of an interventionist. His one big public resignation was, after all, in favour of increased public spending. I know that was on defence, but it was still an increase in public spending.
It wouldn't have been there in some other departments. I don't think. I think he believes in defence.
Let's talk about some of the other appointments, starting perhaps counterintuitively with the new Minister for AI, Kanishka Narayan. Polly, I know you're not generally a fan of it when somebody says they're making a minister for, insert popular cause here. What do you think of this one?
I have a massive soft spot for Kanishka. I think he's really super smart and interesting, and actually he's got sort of quite impressive kind of business background that he's brought into government, which is relatively unusual in the Labour Party. He grew up in South Wales. Speaks a little bit of Welsh. He's great on social media, actually.
He's great.
I mean, he hasn't done any whispering into the microphone as far as I can tell, but he's, and AI is one of those things that is a cross-cutting brief. So it is a general purpose technology that the questions of how do you adopt that into the public sector, how do you support business to adopt it, but also how do you build the right kind of data capacity for the UK so that we can advance? How do you prevent AI from turning into cybersecurity threats? It's everywhere. One thing, though, that we haven't really figured out is how you actually do government of a thing that's everywhere. Because it's why the Cabinet Office ended up ballooning to this giant size, is because it's like, what we need is to coordinate all of the departments, and so we'll put it in the Cabinet Office, and then you end up with actually loads of people in the Cabinet Office duplicating effort. So having an AI minister who is senior, has the status to influence and coordinate, probably the right call. The challenge is Whitehall literally doesn't know how to do that. It is very rare. So what does the civil service team look like around him? I think one thing that's really critical is there's this thing called accounting officer, where the permanent secretary is the accounting officer of department, which means they're responsible for all the money that is spent in that vertical. And it actively prevents financial collaborations. So what actual power to command might the AI minister have? Don't know.
I mean, I think what's interesting about this appointment is, I think he's super smart. Yeah. And I think it's as much outward-looking as inward-looking. So I think this is about AI as an engine of growth as well, because he's a minister across the Cabinet Office and business, which is why I think he's sitting in the Cabinet. And I think he'll work. I mean, I think Antonio Romeo's taken responsibility across government, in a sense, to drive the agenda on AI and digital. So I think that's how you'll get the departments to work.
Away GDS. I mean, that is a weird choice.
She has, but she's certainly doing AI. And I think he will be focused very heavily outwards rather than inwards, in fact. And I was very encouraged. I have to say, I was delighted to see it, because I did have a slight fear that there would be an inward-looking, I don't just mean inward to the government, but kind of protective, over-regulatory position on AI from the government. And I think his appointment shows that that's not the case.
I would agree with that, and I think he's a good appointment. But I think it also shows what a kind of mess removing DSIT is going to prove. But there you go.
Yeah, but look, before we move on, I want to quickly talk about defence, because, fascinating nugget in the Times this week that the Defence Secretary was one of the jobs offered to Rachel Reeves before she said no. But Wes Streeting in there. Sally, we've talked before about the argument for defence spending being made on the airwaves by generals and governments just having to respond. Do you think Wes Streeting has a chance to reset that narrative a bit, or does it all depend on John Healey coming up with the cash, which, of course, he resigned over there not being?
I actually think it's also... I think the reason that Andy has put Wes in that position is that he recognises there's a big public persuasion job to be done as well. So, and what we know about Wes is he's an extremely good communicator. And he's also, by the way, I can remember talking to Wes, 6 months ago, and was somewhat surprised to hear him describe himself first and foremost as I am patriotic, I'm a patriot. I mean, he's very much of that old East End view of patriotism, I think, in many ways, albeit he's only in his 40s. So I think actually he's gone in there to have an argument with the public, build confidence, and then I think what you find with the armed forces, or particularly the generals, is if they think they've got a politician who can argue the case for them, they will work well with them. If they think that's not the case, they won't. So I'm pretty optimistic about it, actually.
We've seen some noises over the last week from Starmerites sacked from government as the Pineapple Pub in Kentish Town threatens to become a hotbed of resistance. Sally, if you were still political director in Number 10, would that be giving you nightmares?
No, it wouldn't, actually. I think they weren't a block either. I think there were some who in a sense, it was almost inevitable they were going to go. There's a couple who perhaps one would have kept, but it's always a jigsaw trying to do these reshuffles, and you've got to get some new blood in. I think it's good there's some 24ers in, actually, new intake, and he obviously had promised jobs to some people, so it's slightly swinging around about. I mean, I think the people who've kicked off are rather foolish, because I think it's not where MPs will be at the moment. So I think there was a big contrast between, I'm afraid, Darren Jones comments to an extent, Steve Reed and David Lammy, for instance, who went with a level of dignity. And I think you get a lot more respect both in your own party, but also across Parliament. Actually, if you kind of go well, I don't know. You can chair a select committee. You can have a different life. I think if you're seen as bitter, it's much more difficult.
Danny.
Yeah, I mean, Harriet Harman showed that. So you can come back into government if you behave in a certain way. I mean, Greg Clark did too. There are people who are able to come back if they behave like that. So Darren Jones and Steve Reed are making a choice. And personally, I don't think a kind of strand of people incredibly loyal to Starmer were proven right in the end. That's not likely to exist as a sort of thick strand in politics. So it's a weird thing to attach yourself to, and I wouldn't have done it. At the same time, actually, I would have taken a little bit more care if I were Andy Burnham, not to create a kind of coherent group of people who would satisfy with him right from the beginning. So I would have cut it up a bit and taken one or two people, Nick Thomas Simmons, or
just to confuse them,
just so that you're splitting that group up, so that you don't get a group.
So we've had a message from Robert, who writes, I do think Sally is overstating any possible collaborative approach from Burnham. He has a 150-seat majority, handle that well, and he doesn't need any collaboration. Polly, I'm going to throw that one at you first, actually, because you're the big fan of collaboration. Does he need to bother with that? Can he not just take advantage of the majority that Keir Starmer never really took advantage of and just bulldoze?
I mean, of course, he can. Two things. One is you have to remember that the bottom majority is very large. It's also very shallow. Lots and lots of those MPs are very fragile, and it is, of course, really difficult to defy the tribal leanings of the whole of Westminster. I mean, we saw this through Brexit. Like, there's plenty of Brexit deals that Theresa May could have got through if only it hadn't been intolerable to her to put together a coalition proposal. It was obviously David Cameron got away with putting together a coalition, but only because he hadn't won, and people were chippy about it pretty quickly. And he had to do all sorts of crazy things, like have a Brexit referendum as a result of that original sin. But I think, in the end, the great leaders are the ones who are interested in other ways of thinking about problems and who look for ways to stitch not just their party together, but the country. Yeah. I wrote something last week, I think, about pensions policy. Partly because James Pennell, the new Chief of Staff, was the pensions minister who sort of kicked off the Turner Commission review, which really cleverly brought together the trade unions and business to think deeply about how the country was going to deal with a kind of, fundamental generational change in what pension savings looked like. And, Blair didn't need to do that, right? He didn't need to do it on a cross-party basis. But actually, with political leadership, you create something that can actually then be sustained for decades. Certainly, if Andy Burnham wants to do something on social care, something which could have happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, because there was a royal commission of some sort on it, and it didn't, because every single time one party or other, first of all it was George Osborne, then it was Jeremy Corbyn, took the quick win of saying we don't want a death tax, we don't want a dementia tax, and sabotage that cross-partiness. But if you want to be able to be a Prime Minister who leaves, a 50-year legacy for social care, you got to show a bit of leg.
Yeah. Sally?
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think also it's easy to say there's this huge majority, but as ever, you look at your MPs, and if you're representing a coastal sort of left behind area, or you're in a rural area, or you're in one of those towns that's not that close to the city, that's a world away. So you end up looking at your MPs and thinking there's lots and lots of subgroups. So you certainly can't assume everybody's just going to march through. You also can't treat them like that. You've got to get their ideas. But in the end, Polly's right. The big changes Andy wants, and I think social care is the most obvious, he has got to do in a way that is sustainable for the future. So I hope very much that he asks everybody to join in. Now whether they will, that's a different question, I think. But it'd be foolish not to.
He's not looking at the kind of social care programs I think he'll get other party buy-in for. I think he's looking at an NHS kind of system, and he won't get that. He won't get buy-in from them, but he can at least approach them,
can at least ask for it,
and then force them into a position where they have to propose alternatives.
They're also going to have to do the analysis to see if that happened, what would that mean for the health service, and how much money at the moment is frankly wasted in the health service because people are in hospital. So I think that's why it can't be done overnight. It's got to be done properly.
Danny, let's talk about your excellent column on thetimes.com. You write about a meeting in January 1993 between two little-known British politicians and a Democratic think tank in the United States. Tell us the story.
Yeah, so the story, and this was told to me actually shortly after it happened. I met with a man called Will Marshall of the Progressive Policy Institute, which was the think tank of a group informally called the New Democrats, Southern governors who wanted to change the Democratic Party and had got Bill Clinton elected. And Will Marshall said to me, well, it's interesting that you're visiting because I've shortly had a visit from Gordon Brown and some other guy who was very nice, but he couldn't remember his name, which ultimately was, of course, Tony Blair, and had come to see him about the policy proposals of the PPI, of the New Democrats. And they talked about welfare policy, they talked about crime policy, but also we talked about this idea called reinventing government. The purpose of my column was that the reinventing government idea, the idea that government should steer rather than row, and which is basically the idea of a purchaser-provider split and contracting out, and the use of competition and entrepreneurial behaviour in public services. What I was trying to show is that was active on the right, but it also came out as well from this new left. And Andy Burnham, in abandoning that, which he has, is abandoning parts of Labour's quite successful current history and saying, as he actually did in Makerfield, I'm going to restore the Labour Party that you remember. He appears himself to have forgotten that people didn't vote for that party, and they didn't vote for it because it didn't work, and Tony Blair has set about trying to make it work. So he's rejecting the part of Labour's history that actually works. When he says the Labour Party that you remember, what party is he talking about? The party of, like him though as a person though I do, Neil Kinnock. The party of the unions and Jim Callaghan. I didn't really understand that comment. Well, I understood it, but I was very uncomfortable about its implication.
Danny makes it's a powerful point. Why aren't people more upset about this? He's literally turning his back on the third way, isn't he?
Yes, he is. He says he is. Let's see. Let's. Right. I think.
Well, your hope is that he's insincere.
I think let's see. No, I'm not saying that. I think let's see. I think he'll definitely use completely different language. He will do some stuff very differently. I think he's looking at what has ended up being the excesses of some of what has happened, actually. So if you can't look at the water industry and say that's going well. You can't actually... I mean, I was very strongly pro-education reform because I thought it was really important to raise standards and you had to free people up. I'm not in favour of mass handing schools over regardless of whether they're good or not. And so I think and I hope that he needs to look almost sector by sector and think, what's gone wrong there? So if you look at social care, partly what's gone wrong is the way that the market's taken over, and actually is ripping people off. I mean, so I think he's going to have to look tactically, almost sector by sector, and I think he's given himself, I mean, if I'm honest, I think he's given himself a lot of space to look at properly whilst drawing a picture. I mean, I'm with Danny. We're turning back into the 1970s, not a good idea. But I don't think that's what he'll do. He didn't do it in Manchester, so why should he do it nationally?
But even so, why not say, there was a lot of good in there, but we got carried away, rather than, as Danny says, going back to, I mean, Danny, you make the point that he's basically going for the people who voted for Clement Attlee, and they'll all be 100 years old now.
Yeah. Although somebody pointed out to me, I said they'd be 100 years old because I calculated how old, if you were 18, you'd be now. Somebody pointed out to me you have to be 21 to vote in 1945. So I actually got the calculation
so annoying being a columnist, isn't it? That's exactly the kind of comment you get that ruins your day.
No, I thought it was a brilliant letter. It was one of my favourite letters. I really thank the guy. Yes, he does seem to be saying that was a wrong turn. But, to be fair to him, he appears to think that. Whether he's able to pull it off, I don't know. But at least he does think something. And it's not obviously an untenable proposition. I just don't happen to agree with it. But I wouldn't agree. I wouldn't. The thing that I think is a bit odd is that he's obviously turning his back not just on Tories or the centre-right, which, under John Major was championing some of these policies as well. He's turning his back on what Tony Blair decided to do and on the new left in that particular regard anyway. Let's see whether he actually does it when it comes down to it. But it's quite a serious shift.
Polly, can one make a case that this is just about reform, as in the noun, not the party? As in, back in the day when Blair did it, the way you reformed public services was by bringing in the private sector. Now that they dominate public services, the way you reform them is by kicking out the private sector.
No. So
moving on.
I would love readers and listeners even to write in and commission us to do a special deep dive hour-long special on this precise topic, because I could talk about it for at least that long, but not right now. So I think Sally's right. It's perfectly possible that that's what he's saying, right? As we are in a very nostalgic era, in that, it's a bit like Make America Great Again. There's a sense that something was lost. And whilst Danny's right that it probably isn't front of people's minds that the thing that was lost is Callahanism, there's something there with people wanting to be told a story that of reversal. But I actually think, so the first wave of kind of post-war reform of the state, really the construction of the welfare state, was around this bureaucratic model, command and control. The NHS was formed by basically buying up all of the country's hospitals, which had previously owned by local authorities and charities, and that happened absolutely everywhere. The total dominance of state bureaucracy. That was then replaced in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and Blair did adopt it with what's usually called new public management theory, which includes the purchaser provider split, compulsory competitive tendering under Thatcher, but then aggressive delivery management. Sort of icon of that is Michael Barber under Blair. And I think what certainly I and all the people I talk to about the nature of the state and the nature of public service delivery feel is not that we need to go back to the bureaucratic, but forward, in fact. And the movement that I think is both most likely to satisfy people and also enable us to have a state we can afford is what's called relational public service design, which is best delivered through a thing that we know Andy Burnham believes in, which is devolution. You actually can't believe in a total command and control state if you believe in devolution.
Sure.
Right? And Danny's right that they are sort of hinting towards this National Care Service approach, but Manchester has health powers. South Yorkshire has health powers. They're not they're not powers if you have to conform to a national system and do it the way the central government tells you. So I don't know what he thinks. I know that huge numbers of really interesting thinkers within the Labour Party are talking about this collaborative and relational models to get away from the transactional flaws of new public management, which are partly to do with the excesses of the private sector, but partly to do with really the very nature of what happens when you prioritise only the things that you can count and manage in a system because you're obsessed with an accountability story that only makes sense at national level. once you've devolved things, the hope is that democracy can hold together a different story that allows you to have a different mechanism for accountability.
Which is why I think, for instance, on health and education, it could be done differently, where it still doesn't mean you're running it all, but it is the accountability is at the mayoralty level, it has to be different from that point of view.
There is so there's something called the Better Futures Fund, which is in the process of being established at the moment. I think it will last from the previous government to this, hope so, which is the largest, basically, social outcomes fund in the world as an innovation in how to design and deliver public services, including with the voluntary and community sector and SMEs. And actually, the people who have been pioneering these things, these social outcome partnerships over the last years are, in fact, Greater Manchester. So it would be weird if that thing, which is neither bureaucratic state delivery nor new public management, was lost under a mayor, now he's the Prime Minister, who has been one of the pioneers of it.
I completely agree with that.
I want to talk now about the YouGov poll for the Times this week, which showed a close race between the three largest parties, with Reform UK on 23% of the vote, the Conservatives on 21% of the vote, and Labour on 20% of the vote. Behind them, you have the Greens on 14% and the Lib Dems on 12%. The pollster says this is the first time Labour has been back within the margin of error of Reform since July 2025, and the first time the Tories have since April 2025. Look, Danny, this podcast is about winning elections, but would we be better off thinking in terms of how to form a coalition?
Well, it certainly does. Certainly one of the leading contenders for the next general election result is a complete mess in which it's very difficult for anyone to form a government. And I do think intellectually we ought to be thinking about that, what that might mean. I don't mean endless political speculation. I mean more at the level of the constitutional, the constitutional. So things like the Institute for Government, and there were lots of, before the Cameron coalition, as you remember, Polly, there were quite a lot of discussions about with things like people who used to work for Buckingham Palace about exactly what you would do in those circumstances. So we do need to think about that. Because with the possible exception of 1924, when there was at least one party that was obviously a lot larger than the other, which was the Conservatives, and then Baldwin ended up kind of shaping the non-Conservative government that took office then, 1923-24. There hasn't really been that situation since, so this could end up very, very messy, where it's not obvious how you'd put the pieces together to form any sort of majority. So that's the first thing to think about. But the other thing that's worthwhile saying is, it's obviously very fragile, everyone's lead, everyone's position. A lot depends on whether you think Andy Burnham's going to be able to create this path where Labour can say, Britain's on the right track, don't turn back. A lot depends on whether you think, as some Conservatives I know do, that Nigel Farage's troubles will ultimately prove fatal to him. That is at least possible. And given there are so many, and what will happen to Reform in those circumstances is then difficult to work out, because it's definitely a real demographic and a genuine political position that goes beyond just him. So it's at the moment it's hard to be sure, but certainly constitutionally we have to think about the possibility of an incredibly messy hung parliament in which no even grouping, quite fragile grouping, can actually get all the way to a majority.
Is there something weird, Sally, about the pattern thinking of our politics, that at a time like now, even looking at the polls, the assumption of all parties is they should operate as if they will be the only party in government should they be in government. So Labour seems to sort of plan the future in terms of, this is what we'll do in this government, this is what we'll do in the next government. The Tories do the same. No one thinks realistically about coalition before it happens.
I think that's true. But I think also, you look at a poll on a single day, and it doesn't take account of tactical voting at all. And I think, as Danny says, what will be interesting is to see where the blocks are and how they come together, and I think people will vote. If I had to guess at the moment, I think people will vote very tactically, even more so than the last election, probably. And that could produce a very different result. Now, whether people will be angry about that just because it won't represent what the polls say is another question. And I do think, the really big question is, Andy Burnham has believed in proportional representation of one form for a very long time, and is very, very committed to that. It'll be quite hard to sell that to a lot of MPs with tiny majorities. And that for me is the really intriguing thing going forward.
Polly, the Lib Dems used to be keen on coalitions. It's been a bit less clear of late whether they'd ever fancy joining one again. But how much does that go into thinking about policy before an election happens? How much does that go into, kind of a presumption, even when putting together a manifesto of obviously we won't be alone in government, but these are things that we could perhaps get through in negotiation with another party?
Well, it certainly went into the thinking about the 2010 manifesto, and not that it did us any good, where we did a full manifesto, like a classic Lib Dem manifesto, probably 25,000 words or something, just bullet point policy after policy after policy. And then what we did is we put 4 priority things on the front cover. And what we said when confronted by journalists such as yourself was, we're going to use any power and leverage that we have to secure as much of the manifesto as possible, but our priority will be these 4 things, and we will do everything we can to secure those first. And part of the magic trick, supposedly, was to put the tuition fees on, page 912 or something, and say, therefore, that wasn't a priority. It did us no good at all, because it still felt like a betrayal to those people, particularly because actually the campaigners hadn't really got the memo, and there were lots of pledge cards and lots of the campaigners pushed the tuition fees thing. And I think you've got to think in that way, but you also... I don't know, anybody in the Labour government right now should spend almost zero time thinking about this, right? And we've been saying this for a couple of years. Actually, the Keir Starmer government spent much too much time worrying about election positioning and tactics instead of thinking about how can we be an awesome government. And so, over the course of the next couple of years, they need to start slowly increasing the volume and the seniority of people who are fretting about coalition. But, frankly, not on the agenda right now. Some stuff should probably go on in the back kind of corridors. But actually, in 2010... nobody'd met anyone there hadn't been sort of secret bar talks between any of the potential parties, because nobody really thought it would happen.
But Gus O'Donnell had given some thought to it, so at Buckingham Palace, and because I was involved. I was invited to some of those things, so I do. People had at least talked about it, and I think
they'd concluded that the only thing that was impossible was a Conservative Lib Dem coalition. So,
but I think, but it's not about that.
No, I know.
That really,
Mechanism.
that's the issue. It's more what do you do in circumstances in which you really can't put the numbers together. When we had Nick Clegg on the program, he said the issue was the numbers. Well, they couldn't form a government with the other numbers. This time we could get a situation in which that's true for everyone.
Look, I had some really exciting questions to ask you all about proportional representation, but it seems there's just no time. I shouldn't have spent all that time at the beginning talking about cats in the army. I don't know what the hell I was thinking. That's it for this week from Sally, Polly, Danny and me. Like most of Westminster, the podcast is taking a break. We'll be back for an episode to look at the results of the Clacton by-election in August. So we will see you then. Goodbye.